Howdy, class. Shasta College. Hope everything's going good. Weather is starting to turn fall, which is good. Cooling down, as they say. Hopefully these fires will go away until next year. Anyway, today I want to talk about a series of films that came out in the early 1970s. Next week, I'm going to hit the last golden age of Hollywood, which started in about 1967 with Bonnie and Clyde and ended in about 1980 with Martin Scorsese's brilliant Raging Bull. And you'll be watching a documentary, and I'm going to have a quiz based on that documentary. That'll be the quiz for the year. Don't worry, it's going to be a take home. Well, of course, you're going to be taking it home because you're at home. Anyway, we'll talk about that more later next week, not this week. Before that, I wanted to talk about a small number of African-American directors, actors, writers, cinematographers. There was a revolution going on in about 1971 or so, and they called it, the era has a name, it's called BLAXPLOITATION. Blacks with an X, exploitation. And some people don't like that title. I don't blame them. But what it is they're taking supposedly the black culture and exploiting it. Well, then for money, I guess, or are they exploiting the actors? Or who are they exploiting exactly? There was enough films there. Some careers were made there. What was happening? We've got this whole new generation of filmmakers coming out of USC Film School, Columbia, NYU, UCLA, and they're starting to get their first films made, mostly predominantly white directors, people like Francis Coppola, Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and many, many more. William Friedkin, Brian De Palma, the writers. I'm going to forget his name now. Anyway, Paul Schrader and the likes. Paul Schrader had written his first script that got big acclaim was Taxi Driver. He went on to help write Raging Bull and other movies. Now he's a director in his own right. We'll talk about him later. Anyway, so college kids started becoming very disgruntled with the Hollywood films that were being made during the 1960s. What we have, and this is important to remember when you watch the documentary, I'm going to ask you to watch next week, things to look at. We're looking at what's happening in the culture, and then what's happening in the films that people are seeing at the time. And what's happening in the culture is a lot of upheaval. We've got a political situation with a Vietnam War is raging. We've got Lyndon Johnson as the president, and even though he's a good Democrat, he is still escalating the war. They've reinstated the draft. You could be drafted into the military because they're shorthanded, and you could be drafted and sent off to Vietnam, and you could essentially be killed at 19 years old. And over 50,000 Americans were killed. And a rather fundamentally useless war. We were trying to stop supposedly communism from spreading throughout the country, the world rather, and so we thought we'd try to stop it there. Actually, the war got going with John F. Kennedy. He was starting to send advisors and troops into Vietnam in the early 60s. Then he was assassinated, and Lyndon Johnson escalated the war throughout his 4 years, and it also brought his presidency down. He could not get, felt he couldn't get reelected for a second term because the public tide had turned against the war. Nobody wanted their kids to go off and fight this war, simply as that. So this was happening, and a large part of the population that was getting drafted at the time was African American kids. Now, well, at the time of the war, you could, if you stayed in college, you could get a deferment from going into the military as long as you stayed in college and proved that you're a full-time student. Well, then later, who could stay in college? A lot of poor people couldn't. They couldn't only get into school, they couldn't afford it. And so they were ripe for the pickings, and that was a lot of minorities in this country. And so many of the draftees in those days were African Americans. And so that's happening. The women's movement is happening. We're coming out. Feminism is rearing its head. Women are tired of being second-class citizens. They're on the streets protesting. They want to be equal rights. They want to have equal pay, and they want to have choice in their bodies. And this also, along this era, the birth control pill came out, and that was a huge game changer. You've heard of the term sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Well, folks, without the birth control, we wouldn't have the sex part. All of a sudden, you could have sex without supposedly the end result getting pregnant. So then we had the free love era of the hippies, Haight-Ashbury and whatnot. But if anybody will tell you, anybody who's been around, there's no such thing as free love. It all comes with a price. But there was a sense of freedom from the way it used to be in the 40s and 50s with the parents of the baby boomers. And I'm a baby boomer. I was a little too young for all this to be going on. I wasn't expressing my free love until much later. I'm not that old, kids. So anyway, that's happening. The culture shift in music is huge. You know, 64, the Beatles showed up on Ed Sullivan, and all of a sudden now we got and Cream and Bob Dylan and the band and big time with Music Monterey Pop Festival in 67, and 2 years later there was the legendary that's what's going on in the culture. And so now the films that Hollywood's producing at this time are kind of bloated, big, or but the young adults of the time, the college kids, the kids that are going, but the young adults of the time, the college kids, the kids that are going off to have to maybe die in Vietnam, they weren't simple as that. How can they relate to Barbra Streisand singing Hello Dolly? They couldn't. And so Hollywood had lost its touch. It lost its audience. Early 60s, and they started doing big budget kind of bloated epics. There's some really good movies being made, but not coming so much out of Hollywood. A lot of it's cachet. And these young filmmakers coming out of film school were looking to the foreign directors I talked about already. The new Italian neorealism, looking at what Ingmar Bergman's doing, and they want to reflect. They want their films to reflect that. These aren't only truthful films, and that's what these filmmakers wanted to make. I'm going to be talking about them all next week. I'm just giving you the run up here to why in about 1971 or so, some black filmmakers got together and they made essentially their own revolution outside of the Hollywood system. So, because they were excluded from this and Catch 22 and Easy Rider, MASH by Robert Altman, Martin Scorsese, Terrence Malick, in that group. Nor is there any women, by the way. Still excluded. Is it? It's a little easier now, I think. As long as you direct the you need to write, it's going to be discussion. You need to have pipe and then comment on two other. That he's kind of a slick shaft music, hopefully attracting a black audience, but it attracted a huge white audience. And so now, folks, they're off and running. These films are made. Showed up right around that era. A little later, it was called Superfly, which is personally one of my favorites. Drug dealer. Yes, that's right, folks. And he's going to make one last drug deal, and he's going to back off and retire. And he's going to make one last drug deal, and he's going to back off and retire. But he's cool. And he's great in clothes, very sophisticated, but he's a drug. They had another great soundtrack by the brilliant Mayfield. And I'm breaking up. It seems like the video is breaking up now. I'm having some internet issues, I think. Like I'm out of sync right now. I don't like it. Anyway, I'm on the, so you can hear me, I assume. If not, and made a lot of money. Now Hollywood is really interested, and they started to get white directors. Like Pam Grier became a huge star, but it also started getting corrupted because Hollywood usually corrupts so much stuff because they want more. And the scene probably came to an end after only just 5 brief years, but it made an lasting imprint on cinema, and it's an important part of our history. People like Quentin Tarantino obsessed on these movies. Younger directors who are working now obsessed on them. People like Spike Lee, who's not so young anymore, but young independent filmmakers who started coming of age in the 80s and 90s.